to the Double Blind Magic Hour, where we cover what's going on in the world of psychedelics, from the latest news on research, politics, and beyond. For those of you who don't know, I'm Shelby Hartman, co-founder of Double Blind, a print magazine covering psychedelics, and today we're joined by Alnur Lada, an activist, journalist, political strategist, and community organizer. He was the co-founder and executive director of The Rules, a global network focused on changing the rules that create inequality, poverty, and climate change. He is currently the council chair of Culture Hack Labs, a cooperatively run advisory for social movements and progressive organizations, among many, many other things, which we're going to talk about. Hi, Alnur. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So I want to start by saying that one of my favorite things about talking to you and reading your writing is that you're someone who does talk about psychedelics, but through the lens of the work you do, which touches on so many other systems of inequality. And so I'd like to start there. How do psychedelics relate to everything that you're doing? Why is this something that you care to talk about and bring into the bigger conversations that are central to your work?
I think of psychedelics and really any healing modality as completely entangled with the broader context of the dominant culture. That when we're enmeshed in the operating system of late-stage capitalism, this is the oxygen with which we breathe, this is the waters in which we swim, and to have conversations about isolated phenomena, including healing or wellness or technology or media or what have you, in the absence of this sort of deeper structural worldview, feels like isolated, atomized, and often contextually irrelevant conversations.
What is your, to what degree do you think that psychedelics should be a part of these broader conversations? Because you talk about a lot of different things, right? Like you're talking about the importance of contextualizing anything. But psychedelics specifically, do you think that they are important? Do you think that they are a catalyst for some of the ways in which you hope to see the current world that we're living in change? We want to contextualize everything, but why is it important to contextualize psychedelics specifically?
So maybe we step back for a second and then talk about culture, right? So we talked a little bit, touched on briefly the notion that late-stage capitalism, or we can call it neoliberalism, or capitalist modernity, or what have you, is the operating system in which we're enmeshed. And so within that system, there is a very strong dominant culture. And that culture has its tenets and its premises. And it tells us things like human beings are inherently selfish, that if we all pursue our individual interests, somehow this perfect equilibrium will be created through the invisible hand and the godlike market, right? Market as God. We're also told that we need hierarchy, we need competition, we are red in tooth and claw, we are inherently competitive. So let's use capitalist modernity as the frame. I like the frame because it's not just about the political economy of capitalism, and it's not just the socio-cultural construct of modernity, but the two work together. And this comes from the work of Abdullah Öcalan, who wrote Manifesto for Democratic Civilization and is the father of the Kurdish resistance in Rojava. And so within that frame, what is culture? Culture is essentially a collectively agreed upon set of delusions and inventions and rules that become generative, right? So we invented this thing of compound interest. So if you have access to capital or a head start on capital, you get exponential capital. And if you have debt, you get exponential debt. Right? Money multiplies in this way. We have a growth debt-based system. And so within that, capital is mediating every aspect of our lives. Where we grew up, what we do for a living, whether we have leisure time or holiday time, who our neighbors are, what their socioeconomic, ethnic, cultural, sexual orientation may be. And the sort of historical structural forces that influence every aspect of our lives are then being replicated in these other systems and structures. So what becomes critical is to step outside the remit and the milieu and the influence of the dominant culture. And so there's many ways to do that. And historically, when we look at indigenous cultures or mystical traditions, there's always been this focus on the transcension of subject-object, right? The notion that I, as the subjective holder of my worldview, am interacting with this objectified world. And capitalist modernity really reifies the notion of the separate self, right? That the subjective self is all that matters and everything else is commodified, objectified, not real. And within that context, when you add these other tenets of selfishness, of hierarchy, of separation, of materialism, of rationalism, we end up in this very sick and toxic culture in which we live. And so the ancient practices to get outside of this notion of the, let's say, the small s self were varied, right? There's, if we look at the Vedic tradition, often they talk about mantra, tantra, yantra, right? The use of erotic energy and life force and relationality, meditation, specifically chanting, getting into trance state through focus, awareness, attention, visuals like mandalas, yantras, etc. And then there's the whole host of other ways to do that, right? Silence, meditation, yoga, and psychedelics. And so we get to psychedelics. And psychedelics, to me, have always been the fastest, most powerful way to disrupt regular state consciousness and access non-ordinary states of consciousness. And so they can play a critical role in disrupting the culture. They can play a critical role in being able to step outside the delusions and the illnesses and the impoverishment of specifically the Western dominant culture. But what happens is if we don't have the broader understanding of what the culture is doing to us, we then co-opt psychedelics as a salve to be better citizen subjects within capitalist modernity. And we hear this often in the space of, my healing, my downloads, my evolution, my consciousness. And so, like every other aspect of capitalist modernity, psychedelics just becomes another commodified avenue into becoming, better bankers and lawyers and doctors and what have you, and doesn't truly disrupt the culture. So there's that aspect of it, which is psychedelics are a very powerful tool to be able to transcend subject object, to stand outside the culture in order to, like all initiations, to reintegrate into the culture in a more useful way. And then the question is, useful to what? So if our orientation is to acquire more material stuff and to get a higher place on the ladder of competition, acquisition, consumption, that's what psychedelics will be used for. And that's basically what we see, right? That's what the so-called psychedelic renaissance is becoming, right? And even the supply chain of that, extracting alkaloids, extracting wisdom from indigenous cultures that have held these lineages for millennia, and then privatizing them, turning them into monoculture crops, selling them at local pharmacies, etc. This is all part of the replication of the culture. And this is what cultures do, right? They're complex, adaptive, evolutionary systems. So they're alive. And what they do is they find the people who best serve their logic and they pull them to the top of that culture. So what does the culture reward? Well, we just have to look around us, right? Short-termism, greed, extraction, selfishness, violence. And if you are a willing subject of that, you will become Netanyahu, Trump, the CEO of Goldman Sachs, or what have you. And so, that's issue number one. And then issue number two is these many psychedelics have been stewarded by indigenous cultures who have unbroken lines to place, that cultivated cultural practices over millennia in order to protect these medicines as their ancestral endowments, but also to protect them against the onslaught of capitalist modernity, of colonialism, of Christianity, of genocide. And so, what we're now imposing on the sort of front lines of indigenous communities and their spiritual political practices in order to become better at what we do and what we're good at as the dominant West, which is more consumption and more extraction.
There's so much to talk about here, but first we're going to take a quick break. This episode of the Double Blind Magic Hour is sponsored by Fungi. Fungi chocolates and fruit chews are an alcohol and psychedelic alternative activated with Kanna. They're perfect for the newly sober or for people that are interested in trying a psychedelic adjacent plant. At Double Blind, we're very passionate about the fact that there's a lot of romanticization of these bigger psychedelics, these scheduled substances, whether it's MDMA, psilocybin, LSD, but there's actually a whole apothecary of legal plants and fungi that come from the earth that are beautiful for connecting with yourself, connecting with other people. I've tried Fungi's chocolates. I did them the other day in the backyard with my friend. It was just the kind of gentle stimulant and euphoria that I was looking for. In addition to the Kanna, the Fungi chocolates have cordyceps, aphrodisiacs such as Damiana, and a gentle stimulant to activate the experience, which is called guarana. The Fungi fruit chews are dosed at half of a chocolate serving, giving you more flexibility in how you build your dosage. So strength-wise, 2 of their fruit chews equals 1 chocolate triangle. I had 1 chocolate triangle the other day. With Kanna, they're able to provide a sort of similar instant magical effect to psychedelics. You can kind of think of it like a microdose of MDMA. Kanna also pairs well with other substances such as mushrooms, cannabis, caffeine. If you want to check out Fungi's Kanna chocolates, then you can get 25% off of your first order. Just use the code DoubleBlindPod at fungi.com. That's FUNGUY, I can spell.com. Thanks for listening. So for those of you who don't know, Double Blind began as a print magazine, and it's still at the heart of what we do. I spent my whole career as a journalist before starting Double Blind, reporting on psychedelics, cannabis, and drug policy more broadly for Rolling Stone, Vice, LA Weekly, Quartz. I did just about everything in journalism. I worked at CBS News covering breaking news, a major newspaper, small media startups, and if you haven't heard, journalism is in crisis. But we started Double Blind anyway because we believe in the value of good journalism to educate and hold stakeholders accountable. We saw what happened in cannabis. Pioneers who put their lives on the line to get patients access to the medicine they needed, getting left behind because they didn't have the capital to compete in the newly regulated market. We've seen what's happened in mental health care and healthcare more broadly, whereby millions of people are suffering, don't trust their doctors, can't afford proper care, and just don't know what to do to get well. In our print magazine, we feature essays, investigations, photojournalism, and much more by world-class journalists who are going everywhere from the ayahuasca tourism industry in Peru to laboratories at leading universities. We're supporting people like you on their journey with psychedelics, and we're covering this movement as it unfolds. This is all made possible by our members who, in exchange for their support, get direct access to psychedelic experts to help them on their journeys of healing and growth, workshops, and a subscription to our beautiful print magazine. Subscribe today at doubleblindmag.com/membership. So what I hear you saying is a lot of meaningful things, but one of the things I hear you saying is that psychedelics can be a tool when used with intention and with an understanding of this moment that we're in to disrupt the dominant culture. And yet, an interesting debate that I see forming within psychedelics is that some people think psychedelics can lead us to truth, so to speak, and other people are concerned that they are basically what Stan Grof said, which is that they are non-specific amplifiers and that they're basically tools of cognitive bias, and they're going to reaffirm whatever you already believed going into them. And we've seen examples in history of problematic, harmful groups, including the United States federal government, using psychedelics as tools for harm. And so, how do we think about the psychedelic movement within this context of historical use of psychedelics for harm? And this idea that if people are taking psychedelics, but they don't have this greater framework of we're living in a toxic culture that centers individualism and a lot of the sort of values that are, we could argue, causing the mental health epidemic that we're in the first place, then what's the point? How do we address that?
Howard Zinn, the historian, says you can't be neutral on a moving train. That there's this ideological imperative that growth debt-based culture moves towards. And part of that is this ideological illusion that progress is an arrow, right? The kind of Bill Gates, Steven Pinker worldview. Everything's getting better. We have a microwave in every house. GDP is increasing. All of that propaganda. And so, look, if 93 cents of every dollar ends up in the hands of the top 1%, by and large, since 2008, and that's increasing, the concentration of wealth increases as the logical outcome of the set of rules that we've created, right? So every dollar of wealth created, no matter what we do, is creating poverty, it's creating inequality. Every dollar of wealth created is heating up the planet because we have a fossil fuel extractive-based economy. And so if we don't step back and see the bigger picture, then we become very susceptible to the delusions and the seductions of capitalist modernity. And we compartmentalize things like psychedelics or technology or what have you. But when we have this broader structural, historical, constellational worldview, we start to see that these are all just new mechanisms and avenues for the growth debt-based system to continue on as it is. And so let's just take technology, for example, and we'll come back to psychedelics in a second. The notion that technology is somehow neutral, that we're going to be able to solve the problems of modernity through more technological innovation, is also part of that propaganda, because there's no question or discussion or discourse around, well, who's deciding on the agenda? What's their socioeconomic, racial, gender background? Where were they socialized and educated? What are their interests, right? Corporations are deciding what technology gets research and development funds. Governments are deciding what is the priority for the majority of humanity and the more than human world. And so I think of technology or academia or media as a subset of capitalist modernity. And the same thing happens when we merge psychedelics into the pharmaceutical industrial complex. It just becomes another tool by which growth debt-based capitalism can perpetuate itself. And so that's the kind of main game that's happening, right? And maybe I step back even one step further and say, look, in a growth debt-based system, your growth has to exceed your interest, the debt that's imposed on it, in order for money to be valuable. That's the economics 101 of it, right? The pie has to grow slightly more than debt. So money is issued at debt, and banks lend that money out, and we're told by the World Bank and the IMF and others that we have to grow the global economy at 3% a year to avoid recession, stagflation. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot, but 3% as an exponential function means we're doubling the global economy every 24 years. Now, if you are in the cadre of power elites, and I mean that in a broad sense, from people who benefit from the system, academics, people in think tanks, but also high-level statespeople, high-level business people, etc. And you're getting 93% of all the life force that is put into the global economic system. You're going to tell us that the only way that we can continue is to do more of the same. And psychedelics as a subset does not disrupt that, which is why we went from the kind of 1960s ban on psychedelic substances to the realization that, oh, actually, if we just co-opt this within the system, this can become another mechanism for growing the whole pie that very few people benefit from, right? And which is also directly related to climate change, ecological collapse, species extinction, and all of this. And so we are actively contributing to the destruction of the living world through partaking in the economic system and through partaking in psychedelics through the lens of extraction and commodification. Now, what we can do about it, is that where you were going, or do you want me to go somewhere else?
You can go there. I'm just thinking about, random person who lives in Los Angeles, not going to say me, maybe me, who cares and sees that the system that we're in is am I allowed to say fucked on air? Is fucked, and wants to engage with psychedelics to reach that sense of unitive consciousness and to step out from their sort of programmed way of thinking. And yet there are so many layers to understanding this moment that we're in. How do we know if we're, it's so hard to know where to begin and where to end in terms of sort of the questions and the dissecting for individual people. I understand the pharmaceutical framework, how that's perpetuating these systems of extraction, but there's also a lot of people who are just choosing to do plant medicines on their own and who want to step back out of themselves, but perhaps aren't quite there yet.
Well, the two are related, right? Because the pharmaceutical industrial complex does not work without consumers. And all of our decisions, even if they're outside of the pharmaceutical industrial complex, let's say they're in just the ayahuasca tourism of Peru, for example, we are still actively involved in that system, right? We are taking planes, we are integrating, for lack of a better word, indigenous peoples into the growth debt-based economy. They are now having more capital flood in. And look, there's no right or wrong in this, right? There's no simply like, this is good, this is bad. It's more about spending time in contemplation, understanding what capitalist modernity does to us, right? The colonization of our mind, body, soul, psyche complex at a cellular level, at a mimetic level. We've internalized the ideas of the dominant culture. And so we can't help but replicate that dominant culture everywhere we go. It's just everything becomes a tool for my self-aggrandizement, my self-evolution, my consumption. And so part of the practice is to actively commit to a deconditioning, decolonization process. And that can start just by the simple act of saying, I'm willing to look at the culture that I benefit from, full shadow and full light, to understand the historical forces that have led to this moment, which are still ongoing, right? Colonialism is not a thing that happened in the past. It's ongoing coloniality. It's ongoing extraction. It's ongoing white supremacy. It's ongoing patriarchy. These are the structural drivers of the culture itself. And so if I'm identified with that culture, then of course I'm going to just continue on as I am. As soon as we step back and say, there is no spiritual without the political and vice versa, right? Every decision we make has political, economic, moral ramifications. And so if we spent a third of the time, let's say, understanding how the global operating system works and how it affects us at a cellular level, as we do, let's say, reading self-help literature, Tony Robbins, Joe Dispenza, what have you, whatever the latest flavor is, we would already have a revolution on our hands, right? If people actually took active responsibility to say, I'm going to understand what this culture that I benefit from is doing. I'm going to understand its impoverishment. The natural next step of that would be a form of disidentification with that culture, which is also
Right.
very helpful to the psychedelic process. And psychedelics, as you say, are non-specific amplifiers, right? They will amplify delusions. They will also break certain delusions, right? That is also a possibility. But if you believe that the world is essentially dead, inanimate matter that we are entitled to do with what we like, uh, that ontology, that way of seeing the world, is going to be imported into your psychedelic experience. And the ego is a very powerful construct. It knows how to self-regulate itself. It knows how to co-opt any insight. It knows how to protect itself. And so our egos are byproducts of that dominant culture. So we have to first
Hmm.
commit to the actual act of saying, I want to decondition and decolonize myself from this culture. I'm willing to hold a critique of this culture, even though my ancestors may have created it, even though I personally benefit from it. And then to then, actively become a conscientious objector of that culture. Like if we
Mhm.
want what
And
the
how do we,
yeah, sorry, go ahead.
sorry, I was gonna say, how do we reconcile the fact that sometimes they can be non-specific amplifiers and sometimes they can break delusion? How do we know which way it's going to go? How do we know whether to believe these quote revelations, these quote downloads? We just published a piece in the magazine about how during the pandemic there were a lot of people that were um basically falling into right-wing extremism, MAGA, that psychedelics were infiltrating a lot of ayahuasca communities, creating a lot of division. And as you know, one of the qualities of a mystical experience on a psychedelic is this noetic quality, this sense that what you are thinking, what you are feeling is objectively universally true. So it can be extremely difficult to engage in dialogue with someone who feels like potentially a harmful ideology that was reinforced to them on a psychedelic is not true.
Yeah. Well, if you look at the history of cultures that held psychedelic initiation, they were intact cultures. There were elders, there was ceremony, there was ritual, there was initiation. You were born into a culture that understood its place in a broader cosmos. We don't have that, right? Francis Weller, the psychologist, talks about the difference between trauma culture and initiation culture. They both share the same stages. They share the break from the ordinary world. They share the uh, kind of inability to go back to the world as it was after you have this experience, and then the need to have to come back into the world as a different person. And even though they share the same things, he talks about initiation as a bounded encounter with death. The culture holds you. You know why you're doing it and for what reason. And in a trauma culture, like the culture of the West, we don't know why we're doing what we're doing. There's no broader cosmology beyond growing global GDP and getting as much as you can, right?
Right. Because we put our elders in assisted living homes and we don't ask them about their lives.
And they were also products of the culture, right? And so
Right.
part of what I'm suggesting is that um, actively decolonizing the mind, body, soul, psyche complex is spiritual political practice. That it is an ongoing understanding of what's happening with the culture, to disidentify from that culture. Because if you want what the dominant culture is selling on tap, you want the Wikipedia page when you die, and you want to make hundreds of thousands of dollars, and the house in the Hollywood Hills and what have you. It's very easy for the culture to co-opt you, right? You are agreeing to be an agent of that culture. And when we shift our ontology to, let's say, the move is from separation, materialism, rationalism, what I call the unholy trinity of capitalist modernity. The idea that we are separate and outside of the evolutionary process, that we can reduce everything to its material constituents, right? The whole world can be reduced to the atom to the neutron, proton, electron, and now with quantum physics, the quanta or the photon or the quasar or what have you. And this is the role of science, right? To find the grand unifying theory of everything. That's the arrogance and hubris we're dealing with. And then the rationalism is the idea that we not only can understand the entire world with our limited neocortex, but we are entitled to do so, that the world is here for our taking. And if you invert that, and I'm not saying amputate it, I think of it as like an overlay, uh, you know, to flip that triangle and create almost like a Merkaba, two triangles living over each other. I would say that the antidote logic to materialism is animism, seeing the world as alive, right? Even Earth system science is catching up with this, the notion of Gaia theory. Like, how could we have inanimate parts in a living whole? We start to take more responsibility for our relationality. We start to be in consent and dialogue with the living world. Then I would suggest that the antidote to rationalism is relationalism and relationality, that there is no quote unquote objective truth with a capital T outside of our relationship, which is always mediated by the subjective experience. And then the antidote to separation is one of interbeing or interbecoming or co-liberation with all beings. So, none of us are free until all of us are free. And when we hold these, let's call it a, indigenous, mystical, quantum queer worldview, the experience of even how the plants meet us is very different. When we shift our ontology and we declare to the living universe who we are and what our values are, the universe meets us halfway, as the quantum physicists say.
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, there's so much here. I love this idea of the shifting of the ontology. And frankly, I mean, I'll just come right out and be a little tender here and say I feel like I am very much still in the beginning of my own process of deprogramming and decolonization. And it can be painful. It can be full of a lot of emotion. There's a lot of letting go, of attachments. So, can we talk for a moment about, I know this is a big question, but for people who are sort of hearing what you're saying and they're thinking to themselves, this lands. Like what he is saying lands. It feels true to me. I want to go deeper into my journey of decolonization. Talk to us about, what are you gaining? What are you losing? What's sort of like the emotional somatic experience of walking this path, of slowly trying to extract ourselves from a system that we know is toxic?
I said this notion of like the spiritual is the political, right? And so I'm not trying to persuade anyone to walk this path, right? Well, it's like no one can persuade you to want to embark on a spiritual journey. But if you are engaging with psychedelics, you probably already have a disposition towards that. And so, yes, there's going to be discomfort. Shattering our illusions is part of not only our spiritual practice, but part of our political practice. And when we benefit from the existing system, it's even more difficult to do because we have to remove ourselves from the incentive landscape that capitalist modernity offers, right? And the reality is that even though that's difficult, our higher self is very comfortable in that space. We know, we see people who have, quote unquote, won the game of capitalist modernity. They have all the wealth, all the trappings, and we know they're not happy people. Like even the social science proves this, right? Like it's
an archetype. Look at The Great Gatsby. It's been an archetype.
Right. And there's a direct correlation between household income and depression levels and ennui and anxiety and suicide and all of this, right? And even rich people within the existing system, even the elites, they are not benefiting from the existing system. So it has to be an active choice to say, I know there's deeper meaning. I know that there is a mystery that I'm not going to be able to control and dissect. And that goes against the grain of capitalist modernity, which is based on certainty, control, right? Just look at the way we interact with the living world. We cement over everything that is bumpy. We put air conditioning in our house when it's hot, heating when it's cold. Capitalist modernity is all about control, certainty, dominion. And so to go outside of that, the less you value the culture and the more you see the impoverishment of the Western culture, the easier it becomes in some ways. And then the reward on the other side is a deeper relationality to the living world and the living cosmos. And that sense of meaning, that sense of belonging, that cannot be commodified, right? There's to go back to Francis Weller, he also talks about the notion of primary desires and secondary desires, right? The primary desires of the soul, belonging, community, gnosis, the noetic experience, those are the primary needs of the soul. And we have created a culture where we elevate the secondary values, wealth, status, power, etc. And you can never get enough of something you don't need. And so the perpetual chase for more leads to more ennui, more depression, more anxiety, more disconnection.
So we've been talking a lot about these big ideas like decolonization in theory. I'd like to zoom in a little bit and talk about them in practice. And I'm going to get vulnerable here for a moment and say that I feel like in a lot of ways I'm at the beginning of my process when it comes to decolonization, and that it's not easy. There's a lot of coming up against yourself, the ego, whatever you want to call it. There's a lot of attachment, there's a lot of pain, there's a lot of shedding. So talk to us a little bit about what this process looks like emotionally, psychologically, somatically for someone who is listening to you talk and saying, this lands. I feel called to walk this path, but I'm overwhelmed. I'm frozen. I don't know. There's doubt. There's fear.
The choice to walk the path is really the choice to walk a spiritual, mystical path. And that can't be done through persuasion, right? The aim of what I'm trying to say is not to say you should choose X over Y. When someone engages in a spiritual, mystical path or tradition, that's the soul's calling. And so you have to have the inner desire to want to do that. And now, if you're engaging in psychedelics, of course, in ceremonial settings, done with indigenous elders and cultures that know how to hold these things, you are engaging on a spiritual path. And it's going to be uncomfortable. And to actively say, I'm going to decondition and decolonize myself from the sickness of the dominant culture and step into something else, into the unknown, is opening yourself to being in dialogue with the living world. And with that will come the disillusion of false identity, nationalism, patriotism, religiosity, and also what will come is a broader sense of identity that's connected to the Congress of life, to the cosmos itself, this deeper, grander being and becomingness. And that's not an easy path, and there is no sort of steps in the method, right? It's self-directed by the soul, but also entangled with ancestors, and being on the path of doing the redemption work of your ancestors, being connected to them. It's entangled with the plants, what lineage you're engaging with, what your soul's journey and mission is. So it's complex, but with it comes this transition from the extrinsic values, the external secondary needs of power, status, wealth, identification, and false refuge, to this broader sense of identity and the belonging and meaning that comes with being connected to something bigger than yourself. And privilege is a constraint, right? Privilege is a blinding constraint. When you're enmeshed in deep comfort, the so-called comforts of capitalist modernity, you can order whatever you want from Amazon.com, you can go to any restaurant you want, what have you. There's a certain comfort in that, And there's also the deep discomfort of knowing your soul wants something more than that. And so there's always trade-offs, and there's always complexity, and we're always enmeshed in these ethical decisions that have no good or bad, right or wrong. There's something more that's being asked of us. There's a need to go beyond the binaries and the false choices and false solutions that we're presented with.
Thank you so much. I look forward to talking about what you have built in Costa Rica a little bit, as well as this trend of folks who are basically trying to extract themselves from this capitalist modernity paradigm, so to speak, and move on to land. First, we're going to take a quick break. This episode is brought to you by Psyched Wellness. Psyched Wellness is on a mission to bring people the healing magic of Amanita muscaria mushrooms with their product, Calm. If you haven't heard, there has been a growing number of folks who are exploring the prospect of Amanita muscaria extracts in small doses for anxiety. And Amanita muscaria is not a scheduled substance in the United States, unlike psilocybin. So it's something that more and more people are exploring, getting interested in, and it's something that Psyched Wellness is devoted to. There's some things about Calm specifically that are unique and worth noting. So firstly, it's a natural made supplement made with handpicked Amanita muscaria mushrooms. I'm going to say that's important because there are a lot of supplements where you don't know where they're getting their ingredients. You don't know where they're getting their sources. And so it's really important when you're embarking on a journey of taking a new tincture, taking a new supplement, that you really know that you are purchasing a product that is made with care, made with intention. You know where they're getting their ingredients. Some of the benefits are that this Amanita muscaria extract may promote better sleep and may help you wake up feeling more rested without feeling groggy. It also may provide physical and mental stress support, which is something I know a lot of us are needing at this particular moment. So if you're curious about adding some calm to your life, you can check them out at psyched-wellness.com and use code DOUBLEBLIND for 10% off at checkout. So, Alnur, we ended the last segment talking about, or you ended the last segment talking about sort of the dissolution of these false binaries of good and bad, right, wrong. And so I'd like to start there for a moment and acknowledge sort of some of the dissonance that's actually inherent in this conversation, which is that we're talking about extracting ourselves from a capitalist modernity paradigm, and yet here I am in a major metropolitan area speaking to you with technology that is made with resources that are extracted from the planet, limited resources, right? You're in Costa Rica. So talk to us a little bit more about how we come to terms with the reality that we will never be perfectly in alignment with our values. If our values are never do any harm to humans and I think you call it the extra human world, or I don't remember the terminology, but basically all living beings.
So there is no neat, tidy extraction from capitalist modernity, right? That's not the goal. It's physically impossible to do that. We are all implicated and imbricated in the life-destroying machine of late-stage capitalism and globalization. And part of the skill set of the 21st century and the 22nd century is to embrace chaos, ambiguity, paradox, what Keats called negative capability, to be able to hold simultaneous and conflicting points of view. So the outside of non-binary approaches, non-dualistic approaches, doesn't mean that there is some safe Archimedean point from which you can navigate the entire world from. No, it's inherently non-dualistic. It's inherently messy, right? So I may live in an alternative community in Costa Rica, but my clothes are probably made in sweatshops. Our farm truck uses fossil fuels. and a globalized supply chain to get parts. We're all enmeshed in the system. What's at stake is, can we be more and more aware of the consequences of our actions? And in that, engage in a political spiritual practice that allows us to do less harm, not no harm, but less harm, and to take responsibility with accountability and sobriety on the the consequences of being human at this time. And we are all, we could say it's none of our fault, but it is all of our responsibility to incarnate within the Homo sapien sapien line at this point, at the edge of consciousness in 2024, comes with certain karma and certain baggage and certain implications. And being aware of that is just the starting point. And then the refinement can begin. And it's an ongoing process.
And what do you say to folks who say stuff like, well, it doesn't matter if I recycle my peanut butter jar because, we're living in a system that's trying to put responsibility on the individual consumer, but, industrial waste is really what's causing the climate crisis. And, whether I go live on land or stay in my apartment in Los Angeles isn't going to make a significant dent in the current degradation of the planet. My actions are going to just be too insignificant relative to the problem we face.
Yeah, well, look, on one level, that's true. And on another level, this is the collective action problem, right? It's the basic problem of collectivity in moral philosophy. If everyone believed that, then degradation increases. So it's not enough just to have the critique of the structure. And it's true, the structure and systems that we've set up are creating pathways that enmesh all of us in that destruction. And simultaneously and non-dualistically, we also have agency and choice and free will. And yes, it's uncomfortable to do that work and decide actively that you do not want to be a part of that system, but it also requires something else of us beyond paralysis on the one side, or some strange American enthusiasm or techno-utopianism on the other. This is the space of negative capability. It's like, well, let's start to create embodied cultures of transition, and that can happen with two other people. That can happen in very small groups. It doesn't need the creation of new structure per se. And simultaneously, let's do the work internally. But it's not the kind of old new age notion that all we have to do is work on ourselves and then somehow the world is going to mirror that back to us, right? That's also a false refuge. We have to do the inner work, we have to do the work at a community level, and we have to do work at a superstructural level. Like, we've all benefited from the organizing and activism of countless generations of people who put their lives on the line, right? Activists from the civil rights movement, feminist movements, the suffragette movements. Like, we have the freedoms we have because people have been willing to challenge structures and systems, and people have been creating embodied cultures at a communal level, and people have been doing individual work. All three levels need to be activated simultaneously.
Right. So let's talk about embodied cultures on a communal level. I think this is a great transition to Tierra Valiente, where you live. I know you don't want to get into it too much, but there are a lot of people who right now, specifically within kind of new agey psychedelic communities, specifically in the wake of, the COVID pandemic, looking around and saying, I don't want to be a part of this anymore. And my answer is to start a community. So obviously this is nothing new. There was a big back to the land movement, quote unquote, in the 60s and 70s, where people were using psychedelics and having very similar revelations and moving to Humboldt and other places and starting communities and trying to live off grid. But it's happening a lot now, even especially where you are in Costa Rica, that all of these people who have had these sort of transformative psychedelic experiences, ayahuasca, are just basically picking up their lives and moving to Costa Rica, starting retreat centers, serving medicine. So what are your thoughts on this trend and how this fits into your vision for a future whereby more and more people are trying to extract themselves from modernity?
Yeah, community like psychedelics, like healing, wellness, cryptocurrency, all of these quote unquote ways out of the system replicate the structure of the system. And so there's a line in the book I co-wrote, Post Capitalist Philanthropy, where we say, um, if you do not have a critique of capitalist modernity, you are contextually irrelevant. But if all you have is a critique, you're spiritually and creatively impoverished. So you need both sides. You need to understand the machinations of late stage capitalism and what it's doing and how it replicates, especially through us. And we have to build these lived alternatives. Now, that's not like a simple, clean, easy, linear thing to do. There's always going to be complexity with that. Um, I had no desire to come to Costa Rica, and things where I was living in New York at the time, and I was planning to do a similar project in upstate New York, and things fell apart, and I moved to South Africa for a few years for political work, and when I came back, there was this opportunity, and we took it very hesitantly and very resistantly because of the gentrification that's happening in Costa Rica. But there's ways to do it, right? Like we bought land and we put it into a trust so nobody owns it. There's no benefiting from the speculation of increase in real estate prices. Anyone who builds in the commons does not have private property. They're enriching the commons, and that understanding of land ownership can only come from actually spending time with landless people's movements and people doing cooperative ownership structures and post-capitalist work. Like it has to be informed by something, and so land is the perfect example, right? Where we're in the Dark Ages, we're in the Kali Yuga, we're in the Anthropocene, and so the one thing that you should not speculate on, which is Pachamama herself, is the one thing that's the quote unquote guaranteed investment, right? Everyone wants to make money off real estate or what have you, and so this is part of the active unlearning and disconnecting ourselves from the incentive landscape of capitalist modernity. There was 20 of us who came together. None of us had a lot of money. People had to borrow from family, and we're talking small amounts. And we gifted that into land that nobody owns. And we said any of the economic activity from the center will go into a cooperative ownership structure. So we run it as a not-for-profit cooperative. There's 24 co-workers here, all local Costa Ricans. There's no distinction between labor and capital in how we vote and make decisions. They have equal say in the direct democracy and governance, and they have an equal benefit in any surplus profit sharing. And so that's not to say this is the only way to do it, but this is a way that is informed by the critique of capitalism and is actively trying to live embodied cultures of transition. We also, whether we make money or not, 5% of our top line revenue goes to a local mutual aid network that operates at a bioregional level, building food sovereignty, fixing houses, planting primary gardens, etc. And there's a deep enmeshment in the community. So there's ways to be good neighbors, and that also requires the acknowledgement that we are settlers here, right? We're not colonialist settlers in the same way as America was settled on the wave of imperialism and genocide and the war machine, but we are in the sense of kind of neo-colonial settlers, right? That we had a head start on capital and an advantage because of the genetic lottery, where our parents migrated to, etc. And so all of that has to be taken into account. Like this idea, this false binary that we either have to be Gandhi or a Goldman Sachs banker. This is part of the delusion of neoliberalism. It's actually, there's a kind of a complex quantum ethics that we have to engage in and really understand what is our co-agency, what is our entanglement, what is the co-creation that we want to be a part of. And there will always be trade-offs and there'll always be complexity. There's no such thing as quote unquote homeland, right? Unless you are actually indigenous. And I know, New Age people love saying we're all indigenous, but are we behaving indigenously? Do we have an unbroken line to that ecology? Do we know the names of all the plants and animals and have that deep relationality? And I also mean indigenous as a political claim. right? Indigenous peoples, uh, it's a political category that we cannot just claim. So we have to acknowledge we're settlers. And there's going to be complexity in being diaspora, in being in other land. And I'm not saying other people's land, but other lands. And so this is part of the negative capability of both trying to be of place, especially when we're socialized within capitalist modernity and disconnection and separation and commodification, and simultaneously acknowledging the historical, structural antecedents that led to this moment, and then showing up in a way that will not necessarily resolve or rectify the solution, but gestures towards some form of um, restoration, some form of reparations, some form of reciprocity and relationality with the land and the peoples that we're entangled with here.
So I'm just going to share that I had the privilege of coming to Tierra Valiente last year and seeing some of the work that you're doing in the surrounding community. And I was reminded that I don't want to say small steps as though I'm diminishing the potency of the actions that are being taken, but sort of pragmatic steps towards supporting individual people can be deeply meaningful. So sometimes when we're thinking about psychedelics, we're thinking about, oh, we want to change the world, oh, we want to extract ourselves from capitalist modernity. It can get very cerebral and it can feel very, very big. But actually, like helping someone put a door on their kitchen can be a political act.
Mm-hmm, definitely. And I think this is part of the distinction between the kind of charity mindset and the solidarity mindset, right? Charity is part of the white savior industrial complex. And how do we solve? And with the mutual aid network in the area, what we're doing is we're learning and practicing solidarity. So we are in dialogue with people. What are your needs? It's community run. There's collective decision making. It's just a different way of being. Now, with all of this, whether it's Puesta de Amor or Tierra Valiente, we're not saying that this is the right way to do anything, right? We're not trying to scale up what we're doing. We partly live this way because we want to live our values. We want to grow our own food, and we want to be in relationship to land, and we don't believe in ownership, and we don't believe because people had a head start on capital, because their grandparents were robber barons, or they were lucky in the crypto market or whatever, that they have the right to extract other people's labor and their value for their personal gain. And so that's just how we want to live. And what people will say, well, is this scalable, right? This is the kind of Silicon Valley question. And it's not scalable, but it's replicable. And we're not trying to get people to come visit. Like, if people are listening to this podcast and like, oh, I want to come check out the project, like, we would rather you not check out the project. Like, we're not trying to, bring in new people. We're not selling land. We're not trying to have more guests. We're trying to cultivate an ecosystem of relationality. And the suggestion is, like, to do that, you could also do that. And you don't need to leave wherever you are. There's like we talked and touched a bit on the redemption work of your ancestors, right? If your ancestors were colonial settlers from Europe to the so-called New World, to Turtle Island, maybe there's redemption work in using the ill-gotten gains and proceeds from 500 years of colonial Christian capitalism and building communal land trusts that are run by indigenous people and people of culture, right? And people whose bodies and ancestral bodies were used to enrich the white settler colonial complex. And so there's ways to do that. And it's also not, when I say let's do the redemption work of our ancestors, I'm not saying let's feel shame or guilt necessarily, right? Like, we don't want people paralyzed with white fragility. What we want is people to take responsibility for their lineage, to understand that our ancestors were products of their context and their consciousness, and they are living through us. And it does not mean that we have to identify with every decision they made or every aspect of who they are, right? And, for example, you and I in the break were talking about the situation in Gaza. And we're in this interesting moment where people are. I notice this among conversations I have with my friends in the Jewish community, who are. It's becoming very polarized, right? There's this deep identification of what it is to be Jewish, and it's like, I'll say it from my personal perspective. Like, I was born into an Islamic line. I grew up in a Sufi tradition. Uh, I do not identify as a Muslim because I don't identify with the institution of Islam. For me, Sufism is a mystical impulse, it's the pathless path. And I will take aspects of that culture as they are in service to life as whole, right? Our loyalty and fidelity is to not to some made up institution or made up desert myths. It's to the living world now. And my ancestors were not living in a world where they understood we were in the sixth great extinction, that 200 species a day are going extinct because of how we live. They were not acutely aware that they may be the last human beings left, or their children may be the last human beings left. They were not aware of the chaos that has been created by industrialized, globalized capitalism. And so, as the heir of my ancestry, it is my obligation to break from their cultural norms and ways of being and not be identified with who they were, but to be identified and loyal to life itself. And that is being in right relationship with the endowments of my ancestry and my culture. I'm not trying to reify uh, the identity of being Muslim or being Jewish or being Canadian or being an anarchist or a socialist or what have you. These are just made up constructs. And if those constructs are useful in service to life, then I'll borrow aspects of those concepts. And if it's not, then I no longer need to hold on to those ideas. And the same is true for the notions of private property, for accumulation, for how I use psychedelics, for how I live in community. And that's an ongoing ethical, political, spiritual praxis. There will be no destination point. It is a journey. And you have to be willing to do so. And your soul's calling has to be aligned with that.
So I think I'd like to wrap this conversation by kind of coming full circle. We talked a little bit at the beginning about what does psychedelics have to do with all this other work that you're engaged in? And I think we've gone pretty far into that. But realistically, today, as you know, as everyone who listens to this podcast probably knows, there's a lot of people who believe that psychedelics could be a novel solution to this current mental health epidemic that we're in, so to speak. And we have therapists that have had their lives changed by psychedelics, and now they want to hold space for people to have transformative experiences. We have, of course, all of the scientists and researchers that are trying to get psilocybin through the FDA approval process so that, we can argue about, whether that's, should be the only way that psychedelics are or are not accessible, and people are having that debate. But it's happening whether we like it or not, while at the same time, folks are decriminalizing psilocybin on the grassroots level to try and create other models whereby people can access these medicines. So I hear you that we should all be thinking about the water in which we swim. And simultaneously, what do we say to people who have already committed themselves to this path and see people's lives, they think, changing for the better as they support them? Like, do we just say, put down your work and go read about capitalist modernity for a year? Do we say, what you're doing might have some benefits, but also understand that you're a part of a system and try and hold the complexity of all of it? Like, what do we say to the movement that is growing and not stopping?
I don't believe there's a way. My sense is there is an ecology of alternatives that are emerging, and I have to surrender and be in acceptance of that ecology. And all we can do is to bring our perspective to the table and suggest that the aim is not to have more inclusion or a seat at the table in the house of capitalist modernity. The aim is to deconstruct the table, to deconstruct the house, to create alternatives of lived possibility that are emancipatory and liberatory. And there will be people who are still within the notion that the role of psychedelics is to become more attuned citizen subjects of the machine. And we're not going to persuade them otherwise. It doesn't matter what we say. Partly, I think, there's these life cycles of excitement when you work with psychedelics. When you first start, there's often the stage of proselytization where we want everyone to drink ayahuasca and everyone to have San Pedro and everyone to have their mushroom experience.
Right. And then if Trump drank ayahuasca, we wouldn't have any more problems.
Right. And then there'll come a point in the cyclical nature of that where you might break through one plateau, but then you hit another threshold and you realize that the old abolitionist line that none of us are free until all of us are free. We're going to have to just keep reincarnating and coming back to this plane of reality until we truly find liberatory, emancipatory structures, right? And the aim to do that is not just think about what would happen if the 8 or 9 billion people that we're going to have on this planet had access to all the things you and I have access to: yoga, Ayurvedic diets, ayahuasca, the ability and time and spaciousness to read and not just trying to keep body and soul together. We would have a creative spiritual renaissance on this planet. And it's why we need to continue to focus on deconstructing systems of oppression and allowing for post-capitalist realities and futures to emerge. And why simultaneously we can't stop doing our individual work, because as soon as we think we have the solution or the alternative or we become enlightened, we become part of the problem. And we also need to do this at a communal level, because we need circles of accountability. And we need people to be able to hold us in our shadow, in our light, to reconnect us and re-anchor us in our prayer, in our shared communal prayer of co-liberation for all beings.
Well, I guess for today, I'll just say that it's my prayer that we can hold that vision. We like to end these conversations with a couple of minutes of breath and meditation to sort of digest what's been said. Will you join us, Alnor, for a couple minutes of breathing?
Of course. I'd love to. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Sky Weaver, resident facilitator at Double Blind, and I invite you to perhaps soften your eyes, wiggle your body and your spine just a little bit until you come to a gentle, dynamic stillness. And perhaps noticing the breath as it comes into the body. Feeling your feet or your seat beneath you. And perhaps taking one deep breath here. And letting out a little bit of sound. Feeling free to wiggle that spine a little bit more. Softening the shoulders. And taking a moment here simply to be. That's it, right there. And taking a deep breath in, beginning to call yourself back into your body. Perhaps bringing a smile to your face and gently allowing your eyes to open. Welcome back.
It's amazing how I've been meditating for so many years, and even just 15, 30 seconds, total shift. So I know there's a lot more to say, but for now, is there anything else you'd like to share?
A reflection on your reflection around what meditation does, similar to the psychedelic experience or silence or tantra work or what have you, is it's the quieting of the ego mind temporarily so we can recenter ourselves, and that is what's being asked of us. And all of our solutionism and all of our proselytizing and all of our believing we have the answer, whether that's psychedelics or cryptocurrency or colonizing Mars or what have you, uh, is part of the delusion of the ego, right? And it's hard to identify that, and we have to create the spaciousness to do that. And the role of ecology is to mirror back to us who we are. When we look at the destruction of the living landscape, it's a reflection of our collective values. And so part of the work of ontological shifts is to re-enter this animistic space where we are declaring who we are to the living world. And that reciprocity, that relationality, that dialogue is going to open up possibilities and superpositions of possibility that are unimaginable to us right now. And so the Western mind wants to have its linear, we will go from X to Y, give me the answer, what do we do, how do we persuade everyone, how do we shift what's happening. But the higher self, the nonlinear mind, knows that if we shift our ontological gaze, the manner by which we approach the world, then new morphogenetic fields and new collective fields will be created. And simultaneously, the structure is influencing our ontological lens, right? And so when we lived in a world of slavery not very long ago, or we lived in a world where women did not have the right to vote, there was huge portions of the population that did not have access to ontological shifts in these ways. And as we change our structures to be less oppressive and more emancipatory, and simultaneously do the political, spiritual, ethical praxis of decolonization and the ontological work, new pathways, new transition pathways will emerge and are emerging. And I'm not asking for blind faith in that. I'm asking for co-agency and co-responsibility in that.
In other words, if you haven't talked to a tree lately, give it a try. So usually we finish by asking folks where they can find you, but maybe you don't want to be found. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm not on social media, and I think my request would be more in line with my Sufi lineage, which is the request is do not see me as a separate person with ideas that you can either consume or refute. That's not the invitation. It's I'm an aspect of you that if there's something that is said that reminds you of what you already know, beautiful. And if there's something that's said that you don't resonate with, then don't take it. It's this conversation is an entanglement. It's an omen. It's a rhizomatic field. It's not some separate object out there. And that's also part of the teachings of the plants and the psychedelic realms, that we are playing in this fractal nested reality, and to shift our gaze into interbeing and interbecommingness, as opposed to reifying the separate self and aggrandizing the ego by giving me my social media handles and likes and the desire for my platform to be elevated, which is the opposite of the mystical tradition, which is the transcension of subject object to be in service to the collective whole.
So you can't find Al Noor, but you can read his book, and you can also read the articles that he has published on Double Blind, which we'll put in the show notes. And hopefully we'll have you back sometime as well after your long sabbatical, where I'm wishing you everything that you're calling in. Thank you so much, Alnur, for joining us. Thanks so much to everyone for tuning in to the Double Blind Magic Hour, and thanks again to Alnur Lada for joining us for what I thought was an incredibly moving conversation. I have a lot to think about in the coming weeks. If you have thoughts about what we talked about today, or you have any suggestions about who should come on, there are so many ways to get in touch with us. You can reach out at magichour@doubleblindmag.com, or also visit doubleblindmag.com/magichour. We're also on all social media platforms at doubleblindmag. I also want to give a shout out to the amazing folks at Human Content who are producing this podcast and helping make it possible. They do a lot of great podcasts other than this one, so if you're an audiophile, you can check them out on Instagram and TikTok at Human Content Pods. Thanks to all of our listeners for leaving feedback and awesome reviews. If you subscribe and comment on your favorite podcasting app or on YouTube, we might give you a shout out. You can catch full episodes up every week on our YouTube at Double Blind. I'm your host, Shelby Hartman. Special thanks again to our guest, Alnur Lada. Our executive producers are Aaron Corney, Rob Goldman, Shanti Brooke, and Alex Field from the Double Blind team, who also edits the show. Our engineer is Jason Portizo. Our music is by Oma. To learn about our Double Blind Magic Hour program disclaimer and ethics policy and submission verification and licensing terms, you can go to doubleblindmag.com/magichour. Double Blind Magic Hour is a Human Content and Double Blind production. Now let's take you out on Brindo by Silvana Estrada.
Brindo por este afán de libertad, por la firme esperanza de cambiar. Brindo por esta fuerza al caminar por la vida y por el mar. Brindo por las almas que se fueron, dejando en su camino claridad. Brindo por la simple idea del viento, luchando contra un viejo temporal. Brindo por la gente que nos salva en cada beso lento y de verdad.
Thanks for watching. And if you're thinking, gosh, I really need more Double Blind Magic Hour in my life, well, you can start listening now by clicking on that playlist button right over there. New episodes are out every Monday, so please subscribe and join us each week on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts.